Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the New England Racing Show, Manchester, New Hampshire, Channel 23, also on YouTube and Facebook. Well, this is part 2 of our working on your wicked cool midget, and we're going to go over setup today. So here we go, right to the tape.
We're going to show you how to set the car up. And our car is a beast. They also have a Hawk style, but they're all pretty basic in how to set it up. So our crew chief PJ and I are going to show you step by step how we go about doing this. Okay, PJ, what's the first thing we do? We square the rear axle, right?
Yeah, so on these midget cars with the torque ball on the inside of it, it's important to make sure that everything is square, because you only have U-joint in the front and not the rear of the drive shaft, which makes it so any little bit of out of misalignment that you have with the rear end in respect to the motor plate will bind the axle up and possibly break your drive shaft, which is not good. So
what we do is we square the rear axle off of the motor plate. So why don't we do that, PJ? Which side do you want to do first?
Yep, so basically we can start on this side, and you want to make sure that the measurement from the motor plate to the center of the rear axle, I go to the front on both sides. You can do it however you want, because I just feel it's easier to measure on the front. So we take it and make sure that from the front of the axle here, I might have to come up with that a little bit. The front of the axle to this is 34 inches on this side. That will change depending on what kind of chassis you have, but the important thing, consult your chassis manufacturer on what the exact measurement is. But for this particular car, it's 35 inches from the motor plate to the center, so which is 34 because it's a 2-inch diameter axle once you go off the front of the axle. So on the back here, so we'll check it on this side. To get that one straight. This one seems to be a little bit short, so by about 1/16 of an inch compared to the other side. So if I were to adjust this, the car rear end's coming out anyway, so I don't really want to do that just yet. But what you would do is loosen these jam nuts and extend this rod to bring the axle back. If you have a Hawk chassis, you have 2 rods here, and you have to adjust both of them. This car will just adjust the top, and sometimes that 1/16 of an inch is a bit too fine of an adjustment, but what you can do is take this front heim joint off and turn it in half a turn to shorten that to keep the bird cage square to the ground, which I'll show you about now.
And then we'll go back and forth a couple of times, because if you change one, it may change the other side. So you get it so they're both exactly the same.
And when I talk about timing the bird cage, what I mean is that you want the top pickup point here in line with the bottom, in a line projected perpendicular to the ground. So the way we check it is this bird cage has a flat spot on the front of it here. That's supposed to be, that lines up with those 2 holes. And before you do this, you want to make sure your chassis is level. We already checked that. It's in within 2/200ths of a degree, so or 2/10ths of a degree. So I think that's about as level as we're going to get in this garage. And what you will do is bring it up, make sure there's not too much of a gap. Up here you can see that there is. So what you will do, actually maybe instead of lengthening this to bring the axle back, what I will do instead is just do the bottom heim joint to bring just the bottom back, and which will bring the bird cage into a will time it better and align the axle better. So if you're going to adjust that, that's the way to do it. The two radius rod style like the Hawk has, it's a little bit easier to adjust since everything's in the rods. You don't have to worry about with this particular style. Is called a Z-link style, and it's a little bit trickier to mess with, but the principle is the same.
Okay, so now you got the rear axle squared with the motor plate, and now you work on the front axle?
Yeah, so now, actually before I go any further here, what we have, there's two ways that you can do, when you align the rear axle, there's two ways you can do it. You can either do it on the ground at ride height with the wheels and tires on the car, but what I have set up to make it a little bit easier for me to move everything around, because it's harder to work on all this stuff with the wheels and tires on the car, I made a set of blocks here that go under the rear axle that simulate the car at ride height, so it's easier to adjust everything this way. And
They're 4-inch blocks?
4.5 on this side, 4 inches on the other, to account for the stagger in the chassis, and the stagger in the rear end, which will tilt the chassis. That's how we adjust for it, is doing a taller block on this side. And it's just easier to do it that way. You can do it either way, there's no right or wrong, but as long as you do it the same way every week and every time you square the rear end, that's kind of, it doesn't really matter. Just do it the same way every time.
Okay, so now we do the front axle.
Yep. So now we'll move to the front end. I have the same thing here. I have a set of blocks under the front axle to simulate where, close to where it would be. These are the ride height blocks, but I use these every time I change it. There's really not a whole lot of steer in the front axle because the links on both sides are the same length.
This one here, I see you take it off.
Yep, yeah, for doing all this with a 4-link front end, which is 2 links on that side, 2 on this side, I'll disconnect this one throughout this whole process just to keep from twisting up the front end, make it easier to adjust. And
So we do is measure from, is it the front of the rear axle?
yep, you want to make sure you go from same spot here, the front of the rear axle, and we'll measure to the
back of the front axle.
yeah, the back of the front axle.
71 1/4.
And this is to make sure that the front axle is square to the rear. What we do, we leave this side a little bit longer. Same here, going to the front of that.
This
The
one's
rear axle.
71 1/4, so it's square.
Square right now.
But if you want lead, what would you do? Move this
Yeah, if you want
side
to
longer.
lead the front axle, which is to steer it to the, kind of lead the right front ahead of the left front, and give it just a little bit more of a positive feel going into the corner. It kind of depends on driver preference. I prefer about this side to be ahead of the left front, anywhere from 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, kind of.
Does it matter what length track you're going to run?
No, not particularly. But the way to adjust that is to lengthen both of these tie rods here. It will move the front of this side of the axle forward and generally move that side back. So you have to kind of measure back and forth a few times just to make sure that it lands in that 1/4 to 1/2 inch range.
Yeah, nothing's binding on you. Okay, talk about shocks.
So on this car we have ARS twin tube small body shocks. These are not gas shocks, but different organizations will have different rules on what you're allowed to run. I feel that for wing midget racing, when you have the wing on the top of the car, that the twin tube shocks just seem to promote a better driver feel, and they're affordable. I think these non-adjustable ones are about $200 a piece. We also, on the rear, we have rebound adjustable on the bottom. So there's a knob down on the bottom of the shock here. We have a plastic band cover on it, but this knob right here will adjust your rebound on that particular corner of the car. This isn't something that you really mess with much unless you have everything else dialed in where you want, your shocks, your springs, your ride heights, your wing, tires, your stagger. You want all that right before you really start to mess with the shocks. I feel it's kind of a fine-tuning adjustment, and I only ever touch it if I feel everything else on the car is right.
Just run us through a general range of what kind of valving you do on the 4 corners.
Yep, so on this particular car, the Hawk chassis is a little bit different because of the the way the rear end is set up, it doesn't have the Z-Link style, it has a double wishbone style. And because of this, we'll have to run stiffer valving on the rear. On this car, I generally run 5 compression on all 4 corners. And for rebound, our baseline is 6 on this side. These are the numbers that ARS defines as your rebound settings. And straight up number 5s on the right side of the car. 5 rebound, 5 compression.
And 5 compression and 6 rebound on the left side?
Yes. Yes. And the left rear, the rears we have adjustable rebound. Sometimes I'll go up more on this corner to a stiffer rebound setting to help the car turn a little bit on entry to keep the try to reduce the crossweight a little bit. It picks the left rear up just a little bit going to the corner and de-wedges the car. And that will make it turn better on entry, and you can take rebound out to help tighten it on entry. It's a small adjustment. If you don't want to make a crossweight or a stagger adjustment, it's kind of a fine adjustment to do. And for springs, the basic starting point that we use is 350 pounds per inch on every corner of the car, except for the right rear. We will use a 325 pound spring. And some tracks, a higher bank track, you'll generally want to go maybe a little bit stiffer on the right front spring. For a lower bank track where not loading the right front as hard, you will want to sometimes go to a softer spring on the right front to get the car to turn better.
And I want to point out what we did to the right front shock. You can see we have a spacer on the top and bottom to move the shock forward. And that way, if you have to make a sharp right-hand turn, your steering arm is not going to hit the shock and push it out and bend the rod, which has happened to us. So that's a preference. You need to have spacers made and get that shock put out. Also, this steering arm has a little bit of instead of coming out straight, it goes back, which helps even more so that it doesn't interfere with the shock. So it's always good to have a few extra springs, right?
Yep.
A few extra shocks. On the Wicked Cool Midget series, we're limiting these shocks to $450 retail price. That way, we don't want people spending like we used to when we raced USAC Ford Focus Midgets 10 years ago. People had Penske gold shocks, $1,200 each, rebound adjustable, and there's really that's how costs got out of hand in the USAC Ford Focus series. We do allow the gas shocks because people have told us that when they buy a car, it might have gas shocks on it, and we don't want to exclude people from racing just because of that. But we don't have gas shocks, so we don't even feel it's that much of an advantage. It's just what you came with the car or what you picked up at a flea market or whatever. So $450 for the shocks. We don't allow a control in the cockpit for the adjustment. We do have one cockpit adjustment, and it's a weight jacker. So why don't you show people what that does?
So basically, this is a shadow weight jacker here. It's a hydraulic, basically a hydraulic jack between the spring and the shock collar. And the knob inside of the cockpit here, if you turns into this, it will extend the hydraulic spacer here and jack cross weight into the car. Kind of depends what corner of the car you have it on. The right rear and the left rear will do the opposite. I like to have it on the left rear because there's more static weight here, and it'll make more of a difference from the cockpit adjusting the cross weight on that corner. But of course, driver preference, kind of where you want it on your car. If you have it on the right rear, it'll be the opposite. You put turns into it to decrease the cross weight and loosen the car while you're driving it.
Okay, and we'll explain that. Our next step will be putting the tires on the car and doing the ride height and scaling the car. So we're going to get to that in a minute.
right now I'm going to talk about how to set the ride heights on the car. The way we do it, there's two different ways. You can get it on the ground and measure your frame height, or the way we do it is by blocking, which is called, we have these blocks here that go between the frame rails and the axle. It's a specific height. These blocks came with a car from Beast Chassis. It's 6-inch blocks in the front and 2¼ inch tall blocks in the rear. And now, what you do here is you put, once those blocks are under the axle, we will turn the shock collar down until it gets to set, which is where it just touches the spring. You just turn it down until you take all the play out of it, and there's no more, it doesn't move around anymore. And over here, did these same thing on the left front. And also one quick tidbit I'll throw in here before we move to the back is this top left link. I think I mentioned this already, but we leave that unhooked until the very end because it binds up the front axle if you try to adjust everything with that connected. So we just disconnect it and set it to a certain length at the end after we're done scaling it. And in the back, it's the same principle as the front. You want to make sure your weight jacker is halfway through its range of travel, which we've already set. And you will turn the shock collar down until it just touches it and take all the preload, or take all the play out of the spring. And the same over here on the right rear.
What's the height of the blocks on the back, PJ?
It's 2¼ inch on the back and 6-inch tall on the front.
Okay.
And we always do this without the wheels and tires on the car, just to make sure that there's the same amount of droop on the suspension. Having tires on will pull it down that extra little bit, and it may not work the same as before. So now we'll get all the tires put on the car, and I'll take it down and we can scale it. So one quick tidbit I would like to mention before we scale the car is that those blocking heights were for racing without a wing. And when you race with a wing, there's so much more additional download on the car from the wing and just the faster speeds. So you actually have to lift the front of or actually the whole car up. So our base setup is this is already as it was as I took the blocks out, or now that I've taken the blocks out, there's actually some space here to turn this in. So I'll add an additional 4½ turns into the front shock collar on both sides to get the whole car up.
How do you arrive at 4½?
It's just a base, just from years of testing and trying to figure out what does and doesn't work. And in the back here, take the blocks out, you have to use a jack under the rear end housing. And in the back, it's 8 turns.
On each side?
Yep, 8 turns on each side from static setting. Or from the block height. This side can usually be a little bit tricky because
6.
the weight up. Yeah, the weight jacker. I'll show you here how to do it. To hold the weight jacker in place.
7.
Okay. And now we will take it down and scale it. Another alternative to setting the ride heights on the car instead of blocking, which you can do it either way, like I say, there's no right or wrong, but make sure you do it the same way every time, is to set the ride height off of frame heights. Now the way we would do that is to go off of the cross tube here on the frame. Some people go off the center, but I like to go off the very bottom of it since it's easier to read. Here, it's 10 1/16 on that side. And on this side is 9 and looks like 13/16. Then on the back here we go also the same way, across the cross tube or torsion tubes if you have a torsion bar car. And from there to the bottom, used to be about 7 and 5/8. And on this side is about 8 and 5/16.
So you have about 3/4 inch tilt in it, right?
Yeah, there's a little bit more in the rear because we have a lot more rear stagger than there is in the front. So that kind of makes up for why there's a little bit more tilt in the rear. So now we will set up the scales and we will show you how we scale the car. Now we have the car on our digital scales here. Before you scale it, of course, we set the tire pressures to, what I did, I set them to 15.5 on both right sides, 13 here, and 10 on the left rear. Those are our cold pressures at the track when the tires are cold. You can set them to your hot pressures, whatever you prefer. There's no right or wrong way. Again, just make sure you do it the same way every time. Sometimes it's interesting to change a tire pressure and kind of take notice to what it does to your scaling. But we also have that, and we have 4 gallons of fuel in the tank, which is kind of, we usually start a race with like 8 to 10, so it's about halfway in between what you start and end the race with. So here, these are our corner weights here, on here, and I'll flip through the menu to get to where it shows our cross weight percentage right here. It's 45.5, and usually our baseline setting is about 49%. So now,
What you look for is 49?
yes, yeah, 49%.
And
So
we always scale it without the driver in the car, correct?
yes, you can scale it with the driver, but where I'm driving, I usually scale it myself. It's kind of impossible to do both at the same time. So we want to add cross weight to the car now. We will have to add turns into the left rear and right front, and take turns out of the left front and the right rear.
And that way you keep the same ride height
Yes.
by doing that.
Yep. So that's going to be roughly about 3/4 of a turn to do this.
Based on experience.
Yep. Yeah. Each car is
3/4.
different. Each car is different. It's a good idea to just kind of make note as to what half a turn in each corner for cross weight will do, and then write it down in your notes. That way, at the track, you will be able to know where your cross weight's going to be when you adjust it. So here, we'll jack the front of the car up and put 3/4 of a turn into the right front.
And take it out on the left front.
Yep, take 3/4 of a turn out there to take weight off that corner. And in the back, we have our trusty old jack here. It's very slow, but it works.
1976, Jack.
And here you want to take weight off of this corner, so you go 3/4 of a turn out, and then the left rear is already pre-leveled up, so this is going to be kind of difficult to get another 3/4 of a turn in here. Okay.
Now we bounce the car a few
Yep.
times. Get any binding out. And see what we have now.
Now I'll come over here. Now we see we're at 48.7%, which is close enough to 49 that I'm going to call it good. And that's our baseline setting for pretty much any new track that we will go to.
And what do we have for weight now on each corner, just to let people know?
So right here, I'll show you our exact corner weights. Total is 1075 without the driver. And with the
Left rear is 350. Right rear is 282. Left front 272. And right front 171 for a total of 1075, right?
Yep.
And you weigh with
Yep.
your equipment?
About 150 pounds, so that brings the total weight up to 1,225 pounds, and the minimum weight 1,210. That gives us 15 pounds of leeway over the minimum, which once the fuel finally runs out of it, we'll be right at the minimum weight, which is the goal. So
What do you like to have for fuel when you come off the track?
ideally, each car is different. This one the fuel pump in this is very much in the bottom of the tank, so it will pull all the way until there's 1 gallon left. Ideally, of course, we want maybe a little bit more leeway than that, just in case there's lots of yellows in the race or red flag or something like that. Some cars that have different fuel tanks, you may need up to 3, 4, 5 gallons to make sure that you don't run it dry.
Okay. Okay, and one of my jobs here after PJ has set everything, we removed the scales, I make sure that I put duct tape on the top adjustment ring, and I tape the ring to the shock body, and that way it doesn't move. Some people have 2 rings on top and they lock them together, and that does the same thing, but we just have one, and we tape them, and then we can just whip the tape off if we have to make an adjustment to the crossweight.
And at this point, we will also set our wing angle. Both Nema and Wicked Cool will have a minimum wing angle or maximum wing angle of 15 degrees, usually with a degree tolerance either way. On this particular wing, the side panels are timed to be in line with the main plane. So we will take our digital angle finder on here and 15.8, 15.6, that's pretty much as you're going to be able to run within the rules with the tolerance. So we will leave that where it is. And at this point, we will also set our panhard bar heights. The way I do that is to measure on the adjuster on this car is on the left rear and or on the right rear, and the left rear is pretty much fixed. So I'll measure from the ground to the center of that panhard bar on this side is 10 3/8. And usually I will run this side about 1/4 to 1/2 inch higher than that. So this side comes out to 10 3/4. So that's 3/8 of an inch higher on this side than the left. So that's pretty much just where we want it, so we'll leave it there. And on the front, usually I try to run that one parallel to the ground, so even on both sides. So on this side, it's 9 15/16, and on this side, it's actually slammed down 9 1/2. So what I would have to do is loosen these bolts here and raise the panhard bar up to get it to be level with the ground. And since I'm just kind of going this quick, I won't take the time to do that, but it's simple enough. And also, we also at this point will set our top left tie rod on this side. The way I do that, you want to make it so it's nice and free, so this bolt slides right through. Right there, it's a little bit tight, so you want it so there's no preload at all in there, so it's not twisting the axle. And at this point, we will tighten the jam nuts on this and make sure that it's tight and in place. It keeps the front end nice and free of binds and moving free. Important thing I should have mentioned before, because it's probably one of the most important parts of your car setup, but that's rear stagger. And usually for most tracks we want to be in the 5 to 6 inch range. That's the difference in circumference between the right rear tire and the left rear. So the way I measure that, I have a nice flexible measuring tape. You wrap around the tire, measure on this side, it's 74 3/8. And on the left rear, you're going to want that right about 5 1/2 inches smaller than the right rear. So this one's 68 5/8. And if you want a little quick way to check this, you go over here to where it says 74 3/8 and come over to about 5 5/8 inches of stagger, which is right.
Okay, well, there you go, setting the car up. And next week we'll talk more about Hoosier Tires. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.